So my name is Joe Offenberg. About a month or so ago, I provided an overview and a demonstration of our DevOps Config product. And what I'm going to do today is actually take it a step further. We're going to talk about the DevOps Config a little bit, but more about the integration with our global our governance, risk, and compliance product. And what we'll do is just a quick recap on DevOps Config and what it does if you didn't see the first webinar. So the idea here, first I got to give you the safe harbor slide, right? So I might be making some statements about the future of the product, and this allows me to do that without it becoming a contractual obligation. All right. Now, there are some other housekeeping slides here. There's a whole series of these live on ServiceNow. You can see the schedule here if there's more you're interested in. Okay. And then some additional housekeeping bullet points here. Please stay on mute. We're going to do a Q&A after the presentation, but in the meantime, you could add some questions to the chat, and that will allow maybe some of my colleagues to jump in and answer them. But we'll do some live Q&A at the end. And then the session will be recorded and then posted in the forum. And then at the end of the session, if you would be so kind to fill out a brief survey, give us some feedback on the session and what other sessions you might be interested in. Okay, so now config data is, so we covered this last time, but just to recap, what is the scope of configuration data? So I came from an acquisition of a company called Spiegel, and we had a config data management platform, right? So config data management is now inside of ServiceNow as DevOps Config. And what it's really all about is managing configuration data primarily in the DevOps pipeline. So this is mostly, infrastructure as code using tools like Kubernetes or Terraform or Ansible to provision environments in the pipeline, including up into production environments. And this config data could be anything from application configuration data, such as feature toggles and API keys and connection strings. Sometimes the release data as far as dependencies between different applications and different libraries and so on and so forth. As the data is moved into different environments, you're going to have environment-specific config data, and that's important that you understand how config data deviates from one environment to the next. But the bulk of config data, the most voluminous of the config data, is the infrastructure, right? And this is the provisioning of VM instances, the provisioning of infrastructure like load balancers and firewalls and so on and so forth. So when we look at why this is a problem, it's because of a few things. One is there's an explosion of cloud provisioning of resources, right? So more and more are moving from on-premise data centers to cloud data centers. So that creates additional requirements for config data being managed in DevOps pipelines. And the proliferation of the agile methodology, where you're making small incremental changes continuously, this also applies to DevOps too. So you're changing, not only do you have more configuration data because you're in the cloud, but you're changing it more frequently, right? And by adopting technologies like infrastructure as code, you have additional complexities to this config data. More and more of this config data is now being built in the pipeline, deploying immutable infrastructure that doesn't change, ephemeral infrastructure that's only temporary. So that means if you wanted to actually change something, you would destroy it because it's just a cloud resource and then redeploy it with some new settings, right? And so that's how more and more of this is happening as we move forward in this new world. So when we look at config data within DevOps Config, we understand that there are actually 4 states of the config data. There's the config data you define in the infrastructure as code that you define before you deploy it. And that could basically take a template, like a Terraform template, and fill it in with some variables to deploy it in a certain environment. Once it's deployed, you might have actually different settings than what the infrastructure called for, what the template called for. You might have deployment specific settings. And so there's the definition, and then there's the deployed state. And then, of course, as things have been deployed, somebody might go and actually change it. So we call this the discover state. We want to be able to discover changes that are happening in the environment after things are deployed. And then the fourth state, and this is the most important, is the history. What was the state of this particular environment 2 weeks ago, 2 months ago, yesterday, before we had this deployment? So being able to track all of this requires a new way to organize data, a way that the CMDB itself by itself wasn't really built for, right? Because this is data that's changing more frequently. And the only way to stay on top of it is by integrating with the DevOps pipelines and the Git repositories and the, and all of the DevOps tools where this data lives, and bringing that into the ServiceNow platform in real time. And that's what we're doing with DevOps Config. So that's a quick overview of what we covered on the last call. We went into a demo in detail on that. So if you do have a chance, go back and look at that, and you'll have some more information about the DevOps Config platform. Now, what are we talking about today? Well, we're talking about governance, right? And what that means is because more and more of the infrastructure is being deployed this way, we need to shift left the governance of this infrastructure. That means we need to actually catch issues that might deviate from policies earlier on in the pipeline, in the dev environments, in the testing environments, right? So we have to apply governance policy in these environments. So how do we do this? Well, first we have to take the governance frameworks that our governance and risk and compliance tool does so well, mapping those frameworks to control points and so on, understanding the risk, understanding what actually needs to be managed, right? And then taking the DevOps policies, specific policies for saying, hey, this particular key value pair, this particular setting in a config file, now mapping it to those policies. So I'll give you an example. You might have a framework that says you have to lock down what email domains you send notifications to, like IT notifications, right? You can only send them internally. So we will actually have a policy that looks in config files for those email domains to make sure that those domains are specifically listed and you don't have additional domains. Another policy we might have is something for enforcing certificate validation. Developers, often like to turn off certificate validation in the dev environments, right? Why do they do this? Well, because sometimes it's difficult for developers to get valid certificates. They spin up a new resource, especially a cloud resource. It has a new name and a funny domain, and they can't get a proper certificate for it. So they turn off certificate validation. Well, now they leave that setting turned off when they deploy to production, and we need to be able to catch that, right? So DevOps Config is very good at catching that, but there's actually a policy in a governance framework that enforces that control needs to map up to. And that's what we're doing here. We're mapping the low-level settings and the controls on those settings up to those policies. So when there is an issue, we can see what policy is impacted by that, okay? So this is actually shifting left the controls, being able to validate these settings before they leave development, right? So the developer will check it into Git, change a setting, and we want to catch it before it's deployed to the next environment. And we do this, we have a new capability called the policy as code engine. That means the actual policy that we're using to enforce that control is written in JavaScript, right? And that makes it very DevOps friendly. That means you can, you can store it in Git if you wanted to, and you can use it. It makes it more deployable and more portable and easier for developers to create the code in any way they choose to. Okay, and the other part of this is a config data model. That's now, this is the technology that we acquired in the Sweegle acquisition a couple of years ago. Again, that's the acquisition. That's where I came from. And this data model is a way of organizing config data in a hierarchical way that makes it easy to sort of deduplicate config data, to understand the relationships between config data at the component level and then at the application level, and so on and so forth. So this data model makes it easy to then take snapshots of the config data. So as things change, you maintain that history. Remember, that's one of the states is to track the history. And now we actually attach those snapshots to change records in ServiceNow. So as you deploy a change to production, the snapshot of that config data is attached. So you'll see that as well. I can show you a little bit of that in the demonstration. Okay, so we bring this all together, and we allow you to automate the control of these control point objectives, right? The actual control points are actually automated through the DevOps policy, DevOps config policy. Okay, now another scenario we're going to talk about is what happens when you need an exception. It's great that you could enforce the policy. I could even stop a pipeline from deploying to production because it broke one of these policies, right? But sometimes you need an exception. So one of the great things about governance, risk, and compliance is that we can manage those exceptions, right? So we're going to take those exceptions and manage them in a workflow where the compliance managers can review them, can say, hey, can we allow this to go to production or not? Maybe there's some really good reasons why we have to allow this exception to take place, and all of that is tracked, and all of that is going to be saved in a transparent way, so that the auditors will now have the ability to see who approved what exceptions, when it was approved, why was it approved, what was the reasoning behind it, and so on and so forth. So that's what I'm going to show you is not just the ability to map the config policy to the controls, but also to handle exceptions, which you have to be able to do because exceptions will come up. Okay, so this is what the demonstration will look like. One, on the governance side, you adopt control objectives, right? And these could be, there are a lot of frameworks out there. There's COBIT, there's SOX compliance, there's GDPR compliance, right? And the DevOps folks now have to create config validation policy that match up to those objectives, right? And make sure that developers have the correct access or don't have the access that they need, or that they might, to allow them to do certain things, to enforce like make or checker rules that a lot of these policies have, where somebody has to make a change, and as well as somebody has to check that before it moves to production. These are, there's quite a few of these policies. And then if someone violates a config validation policy, let's say a developer makes a change to a setting, now they're deploying that config file to production. If it violates it, we have to be able to stop it, but also allow them to request an exception. And that's what I'm going to show you. And then if the exception is okay, if they have good reason for it, we can approve and reject it. And, most importantly, all of this gets logged for the auditors. All of this is tracked. There's an approval process. There's a workflow around it, and nothing will get missed here. I think I'm going to start with the demo next, but maybe it would be a good time to check if there are any questions in the chat before I jump into the demo. Does everybody understand the concept here? I'll take a look at the chat myself. Let's see. Okay, so unless I'm missing something, I don't see any questions. So I am going to go right into the demo here. So in our previous session, we had this Jenkins pipeline. And as you can see, what we do is we retrieve the sources from Git. That means, after developers make all their changes, we kick off a pipeline. We have an environment where we build the application. We also validate the code. This is something we've been doing for many years. What's new is now we're also validating the config data. So we're applying the same level of scrutiny to the application configuration that we've been doing for many years with the code, like unit testing and some static code analysis. Here we upload it to ServiceNow, and we're going to validate it. If it all looks good, we publish what's essentially an artifact that can now be deployed to the various environments. Where here we're going to export the configuration, and then we're going to do some functional testing in another environment. Eventually, that makes its way to production. Of course, if we do go to production, we need a change record, right? That change record has all the information, including that config data snapshot that I've taken over here with the new config changes, right? So now I have a config data snapshot that's attached to that change record, okay? So what happens if I make a change? So here's a scenario where I've updated a CloudFormation template to deploy a database here in a different region. So I made this change, and the change actually basically says in the previous, what I did was I updated this config file. I changed it from EU Central to US East, okay? So the database used to be deployed in the EU, but now I'm deploying it to US East. And why am I doing this? Well, perhaps there could be a power issue in the data center in the EU. You know, there could be some power shortages, right? That's not an unrealistic scenario given the current geopolitical situation. So we have to now start redeploying some resources to a US data center, right? So that's what I'm doing here. However, this EU database could potentially have EU customer data in it, right? So this is a violation of a GDPR policy, right? So GDPR is a framework for managing data and privacy of that data in the EU. But you know, many American companies have to deal with this as well as they are globally deploying resources all over the world in the cloud, right? So now, how do we know this mapping exists? Well, within ServiceNow, and I'm going to show you the compliance workspace here. What you'll see is that when we look at a control objective, and I'll find one here, and I'll find that GDPR one. We can actually find the mapping to the config data policy, right? And if you saw on the previous demo, here's the config data policy here. And this is where we can map, and I could add additional policies and map that, looking at the certificate validator and so on and so on. So this is coming directly from the DevOps config application, okay? So what happens is when I make that change, it's going to fail. The validation is going to fail, right? It's going to fail, and it's going to tell me, hey, that particular policy, the AWS region check, doesn't allow US East. It's looking for, the rule says it has to have the EU in the region, meaning it has to be deployed in the EU, okay? So as a developer, I have two decisions. I can make one of two choices. I can go back into this and change it back. I could change the config setting back to EU. However, if I need to redeploy because of power issues, then that doesn't solve that problem, right? So the other thing I can do is I can request an exception, right? So from this, okay, so I'm in the compliance workspace now. Now as a, let's say as a DevOps person, I can go into DevOps config workspace here, and I can find that particular validation that failed. So this is in the Globex application. When that pipeline ran, there was a snapshot that was taken, right? That snapshot failed validation, okay? So we'll see the validation results here, and it failed. So what I can do is I can now request an exception, okay? So this is basically what happened inside of DevOps config. In the Jenkins pipeline, it shows up as this. So this is the way all the developers see it. They say they can't, they can't deploy to production because of this issue. So as a DevOps person, I can request that exception. So I'll go ahead and do that here. Where was I? Here was the refresh this. I'll get that snapshot back. Okay, so when I request the exception, it brings me up a window here. And I'm going to say why? Well, I'll say power issues in EU data center, right? So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and make that request. I can give it an end date. Let's say, let's give it 30 days to work itself out. And this will put a policy exception specifically on this policy in this environment, I'm not asking for a global policy exception. I'm being very specific that in the Globex product environment, I need to put the database in the US, and I'm making that request. So this request now goes in, and now it kicks off a workflow on the compliance side, right? So if we look here at the policy exception list, that's going to show up here. If I sort by name, okay, I see there's actually a couple here. This is the latest one. And what happens is now, as a policy manager, there's a workflow, right? So I have to analyze it. I have to look at some details. Okay, power issues in the EU data center, that's significant. Does policy allow me to override that? Well, we're gonna send this off to an approver. And we're going to actually set the risk rating as, let's say, medium. Well, in this case, maybe it's low because we're not going to impact too much by running it in a different data center. And I'll go ahead and now save this. And once all of the risk information is filled out, I then get this button here where I can request approval. If the risk isn't analyzed and assessed, we won't be able to request the approval. So I'll go ahead and request the approval now. So now this goes into the approval workflow. Somebody has to approve this. So if I bring up the list here, see, okay, Frank Gorey's the approver. I'm going to go ahead and click on this. And we're going to say, okay, let's say Frank comes in and approves this. We'll save this record as now approved. Okay, so now we have a policy exception that's approved. So the idea being, if I were to run this again, and first I'll make another, let's say a basic change to the configuration of that template, right? I'm just going to change a port number. So I could run the pipeline again. The pipeline's not going to be happy if I change it if I run it without actually changing anything. So if you've seen DevOps change velocity, what I'm doing here is I'm linking this commit to a JIRA work item. That's what this notation is here, but that's for a whole different demo, integrating with JIRA. I'm going to, okay, so I updated the database port. I'll go ahead and approve it. But I left the AWS region as US East. I didn't change that. So what I'm expecting now is if I run my pipeline, now that I committed that, we're going to go ahead and run the pipeline again. I would expect this now to be okay, right? Because I have that exception. And so as a developer, I don't need to know about what's happening in ServiceNow. I stay in my tools, and I just know that, hey, I need an exception to a policy here to get this deployed to production. The DevOps folks will handle that request. The compliance folks will review and analyze it and decide if this is okay. And once that all goes into place, I could then make make further changes and go ahead and run the pipeline again. And that's what I'm doing now. Let's see if we make it. So, okay, we're uploading the config files, the changes I made to the CloudFormation templates. We create a new change set. So all of this is happening in an automated way through the DevOps pipeline. And then once we're done uploading, we'll start the validation process. And that's where last time we failed, right? In the previous job, we actually failed because of that. And the failure showed up as a test case, right? And then, it was very clear why we failed. So if we go ahead, now let's see here, okay, so this time it's not red, it's yellow. We allowed the pipeline to continue, although we do indicate that, hey, this isn't 100% perfect. The test case still failed, but if we look at the validation step, we actually say, hey, it passed with an exception, okay? The validation failed, but we allow it to go through with an exception. That allows the pipeline to continue, and that allows the pipeline to go to production and create what would be a change record, right? Because the change record has to be there for us to get to production, okay? So let's see, how are we doing? I think this takes a minute. Let's see, do we have any questions, anything in the chat at this time? I guess if there's some feedback, that would be useful. Does this conceptually make sense to everybody that's joining? You understand why we need to validate config files and config settings, and also why we need to connect this to policy in GRC, governance, risk, and compliance. Yeah? All right, so now before we go to production, we get a change control step, we get a new change record. Okay, so if we go and look at the change record, what you'll see is we've actually, here it is here, we've actually attached that pipeline here to the change record. And this is useful, right? Because now I know what actual config data was deployed with this particular change, okay? I also see the commits from Git, I see the test summaries, I see even the software quality scan from SonarQube. All of that is part of this change record. It's a very comprehensive change record we create automatically. It includes all the test results passing. If you've seen this demonstration, you know that we can take any of these data points and use change approval policies to automatically approve this change, right? But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and approve this, and now we'll get a record that this was deployed manually. Once this is approved, this will go and reach the implementation stage, and that'll be approved, okay? So now we have so that concludes the integration with GRC, right? So that's the governance integration. But now we have deployed config data. So I just wanted to give you a taste of some other, since we have some time, give you a taste of some other integrations we have with DevOps Config, and that's with the service operations workspace, right? Because understanding what's deployed has implications when you're trying to figure out what went wrong. The first question you always ask is what changed? That's one of the major use cases of change management, is tying it back to incidents so you can see exactly what changed. Well, because we're automating so much of these change records, and you're going to get a lot of change records, it becomes really valuable to tie these change records to, like in CMDB, the CIs, and the alerts. So I'm going to bring up an alert here. Okay, and this alert says, okay, we haven't had any payment process for the last 15 minutes. That's a pretty serious alert. And what we can see here is that we've determined that there's been some changes, right, recently, and these are the probable root cause based on the changes, right? This is the probable root cause. And what we do is we take the latest change, and now I'm going to bring up the change record that you've seen before. But in this record, I have attached the config changes, right? So the actual snapshots I'm taking with DevOps Config, I can see them on the timeline. I can see, here's when I got the alert, and then here's when I took a snapshot here, I took a snapshot here, there was a bunch of activity over here. I can go back, weeks and see all the snapshots that took place in the timeline. So why is that useful? Well, I could also compare, I could see into the data model and see all the settings and changes. So if I'm looking for a specific setting, I could find it in the data model. I could do a search and find it here. But more importantly, I can say, just show me everything that changed. In the most recent change, I see, okay, I changed the region from US East, EU Central. Okay, that I'm aware is a compliance issue, but that's not what broke the application, right? I might have to go back even further. Let's say there was performance degradation, like 2 weeks ago you made a change, and you'd want to see what changed in the last 2 weeks, or in the last 5 days, but it didn't become an issue until recently. What we can see is the snapshots that apply, and I could compare from previous snapshots all the way up through the target snapshot, which is what's been deployed now. Okay, so that is the advantage of this. So I get a list of snapshots. Let me go back even further. Get some more snapshots. And being able to make comparison between the snapshots within the service operations workspace. Okay. See, now I can go back. There's a list of all the snapshots I can go back to. I can go back several weeks, back to August 17th. I could run a comparison between what I have in place now and what changed on August 17th, because that's that might be the point at where degradation started, right? Performance degradation started. And I can see here, I can see all the different changes. And you see that there's the port number change I saw before, but now I also see there's a firewall rule change. And hey, that's going to be most likely what caused performance degradation. Somebody changed the firewall rule, and so on and so forth. We can figure these things out. Okay, so let's see. Do we have any questions? The approval was in the change record for DevOps. Would that not be performed in the DevOps orchestration tool rather than the change record? So the way we work it is in the DevOps orchestration tool. That's a good question. The approval is actually in the change record, but we do link the change record back to the orchestration tool. So why would we do that? Well, we need a change record, right? Because we're deploying to production, and we need and depending on what is impacted by that change, right? And it could be many things. You might have to get different approvers involved. Also, we have the ability to say, hey, let's say there was an issue with the quality scan, right? Let's say you had a security vulnerability, right? That might require an InfoSec person to be dynamically added to the approval list. So this is something that's, this is something that ServiceNow and the change management does, natively, being able to take these workflows and using decision tables, decide who needs to approve what. And it's a lot easier to do that in ServiceNow, where you can reference the CMDB, you can reference the assignment groups of the CIs, so on and so forth. So that's why we manage the approval in CI. Now, if you go back further left, you might have an approval for a change request, right? Not a change request, a pull request. That's something you handle in the orchestration. That's something you handle in the pipeline. But once it reaches production, then you need a change request and you need a change request approval. I hope that answers your question. If this deployment includes downtime, impacted downstream application CIs, are the impacted CIs approval groups added to the change request? Yeah, that could happen. I mean, that's something that you can handle in the backend integration hub flow. So all of this is governed by an integration hub flow, and you can decide that you want to go, let's say, one level away from the CI using the relationship model, using the view you have here of the configuration item. Oh, it's not attached. You should be able to go, one level or two levels away and see what else is impacted and add those approvers to the approval list. But that's a good question. Yeah. Okay, are there any more questions? All right, then I think we are going to wrap it up here. Let's see if there are no more questions. We could end this one early. Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to show you the DevOps config again and the integration with IRM and the governance, risk, and compliance and the control point exception use case. For any other questions, you can, okay, one more question before we leave. What are the product modules required? So what I showed you was the compliance workspace module, the service operations workspace module, if you want to do that alert integration where you do the root cause analysis. And of course, on the DevOps side, you need DevOps config, which is a product in all of these are in the store. You get them through the studio, through the plugin installer. The previous demo, the URL. I think if we go back to that first slide, then you have a list of all of the. If you do a search on Google for ServiceNow, and this is how I find it. I go to ServiceNow Live, and you'll get a list of all the demos. And you have to register if you're not registered, and then you'll get a list of all the previous and all the upcoming. And the previous ones will show recordings. Yeah. Okay. Any more questions? DevOps config is actually part of ITSM Pro. So the question is, what are the DevOps config license requirements? You get DevOps Config and DevOps Change Velocity with ITSM Pro. There's no separate license for it. You just have to be part of the Pro level of ITSM. Oh, another question. Does it help with setting preventative controls? Why is it called left turn? Well, I think we're calling it shift left because that's like a DevOps expression a lot of people use to say we're going to try and shift as much of the quality gating and the approvals and the idea in DevOps is to try and fail fast, right? And if you're going to fail fast, you have to front load a lot of the quality checks and the gates. And so that's where the shift left comes from, because if you look at the typical picture of software development lifecycle, you have development on the left and then deploying production on the right. So what we're doing is shifting everything to the left, including the controls on the DevOps config settings, which has always been part of something that you did in operations all the way on the right side. So now we're shifting left. All right. Cool. All right. Well, thank you all. And I'll see you next time. Enjoy the rest of the week.